The smoke came up off the back of the barn in a thick black coil, and Hetty Renner was on her knees at the chicken coop door with the wire in her hands when the boy started to scream from the loft, and the cowboy who had ridden past her gate at 6 in the morning every day for a year reined the bay mare in at her road and looked once and swung down. "Ma'am." She did not turn. She had her hands in the chicken wire, and she had cut her thumb to the knuckle, and she was past noticing. "Ma'am, the barn. Tobe is in it." "Where?" "The loft." He left the bay mare at the road with the reins on the ground, and he ran. He did not call back to her. He did not ask another question. He went past her at the coop, and he went around the side of the barn, and he kicked the loft ladder up off the dirt where it had fallen, and he set it back against the wall, and he went up it. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Hetty Renner left the wire. She left the cut thumb. She came around the side of the barn at a run with her apron half loose at her waist and the smoke already in her eyes, and she stood at the foot of the ladder, and she looked up and she said the name of her boy once. Plain, like she was speaking to a man who had come in for supper. "Toby." The boy did not answer. The cowboy answered from the loft. "I have him." He came down the ladder with the boy on his shoulder, the boy of 7 with his face black and his eyes open and his arms locked around the cowboy's neck, the way a small animal locks around a branch in a flood. The cowboy stepped off the bottom rung, and he set the boy down on his own feet on the dirt, and he put one steady hand on the back of the boy's neck, and he said, "Breathe, son." And the boy breathed. The cowboy looked at Hetty across the boy's head. "The hay is dry. I know it. There's a chain pump at the back. There is." He went for the chain pump. She did not move for one breath. She had not let her hands shake the whole time she had been on her knees at the coop, because she had trained that out of herself the first August after her husband died, when she had understood that shaking would not put the cow in the pen, or the boy in the bed, or the meal on the table. She did not let them shake now. She put her hand on the back of her boy's neck where the cowboy had set his, and she pushed him gentle toward the kitchen door of the small farmhouse, and she said, "You sit at the table and you do not move." She went for the pump. They got the fire out by 10 o'clock. The cowboy worked the chain pump, and she carried the buckets, and they took the south wall down to bare timber by hand, because the south wall was going to take the rest of the barn with it if they did not. The cowboy did not speak past 1 or 2 short sentences the whole morning, the kind of sentences a man says when a thing has to be said and not before. The water bucket here. The board lifts that way. Step back. Done. He worked the way a man works who has worked outdoors at hard things for a long time and has stopped wasting motion. He pulled the burning south boards down with the long pry bar, and he set them on the dirt away from the barn, and he kicked dirt over them, and he went back for the next board. She carried the buckets from the chain pump to the line he had set at the wall, and she set the buckets down, and she went back. They did not speak about the work. The work moved between them. When it was done, he stood in the yard at the back of the barn with his shirt black and his hat black, and a long burn at the inside of his left forearm that he had not yet looked at. And he looked at the barn, and he said, "You lost the south wall and the loft floor. You did not lose the barn." Hetty Renner stood in the yard beside him with her apron black to the hem and her dark hair come loose from its pinning, and her cut thumb still bleeding, and she looked at her barn, and she said, "I lost the loft. Loft floors are pine. Pine is at the mill." She looked at him for the first time properly. He was 33 or 34. He was lean and dark, and a steady gray eye and a face that had been weathered by a hand at outdoor work for a long time. Faded blue chambray work shirt, now black at the front, dark trousers worn at the knee, scuffed brown leather boots, a brown felt hat now ruined. He had a quiet on him. She had been registering at the edge of her road every morning for a year without ever once putting a name to it. She put a name to it now. The name was Steady. She said, He said, Cale Brune. Mr. Brune, ma'am, you have been riding past my gate every morning since last September. I have. She did not ask him why. She did not ask him whether he had known the barn was going to go up. She did not ask him why he had stopped on this particular Tuesday morning. She looked at his arm where the burn ran the inside of his forearm from the wrist to the elbow, and she said, The burn is going to need lard and a clean cloth. I have a clean cloth in the saddlebag. You will come into the kitchen. He went out to the road, and he led the bay mare in through the gate, and he tied her to the rail at the side of the house, and he came in through the kitchen door. The boy was still at the table where she had set him. The boy had not moved. The boy had his hands flat on the wood of the table, the way a child sits at a table when he has been told to sit at it and has not yet decided whether to be frightened. Hetty Renner put a tin basin of clean water on the kitchen table, and she put a small earthenware crock of rendered lard beside it, and a folded square of clean cotton sheeting from the chest, and she sat the cowboy down at the chair across from her boy, and she took his left arm by the wrist and she turned it palm up on the wood of the table, and she went to work. The boy watched her. The cowboy watched the boy. Hetty Renner did not look up. He saved my Tobe, the boy said. The cowboy did not answer. Hetty Renner pressed a clean cotton cloth into the lard and laid it gentle along the inside of his forearm, and she said, Breathe out when I tie it. He breathed out. She tied it. She set his arm back down on the table. She said, You will stay for noon dinner. He said, Ma'am. She said, You will stay for noon dinner because you have a burn from wrist to elbow, and you're not going to ride south with that arm holding the reins. You will stay until I have changed the cloth at 4 o'clock. After 4 o'clock, you will do as you see fit. That is what I am asking. He thought about it for the space of one breath, the way a man thinks about a thing he has already decided. He said, That suits. That was the first morning. The barn was a question that did not get answered in a day. The south wall and the loft floor would have to come back up before the rains in October, and pine was at the mill at $3.10 a board. And Hetty Renner had a small steel coin box at the back of her sideboard that she had been adding to from the eggs and the butter for 2 years, and the coin box held $104. The barn would take $200. She did not say this out loud at noon dinner on the first Tuesday. She set the platter of cold beef and the bowl of beans on the kitchen table, and she sat the cowboy at the chair across from her boy, and she sat herself at the head of the table, and they ate the noon dinner in the kind of quiet a kitchen has when 2 adults have been working at the same hard thing all morning, and one of them is a child. The cowboy ate slow. The boy ate fast. When the cowboy finished, he set his fork down and he said, The timbers in the loft are oak. She said, My husband cut them. They are oak. He said, The south wall is pine. She said, The south wall was my husband's father. He nodded once. He didn't say anything else. He stood up. He took his hat off the back of the kitchen chair where he had hung it, and he carried his plate to the kitchen block and he set it down. And he came back to the table and he set his hand on the table beside her boy's plate for one quiet beat, the way a man sets a hand on a door frame when he is about to go through it. He said, 4 o'clock. She said, 4 o'clock. He went out. He led the bay mare back to the road, and he rode south the way he rode south every evening at 6, and she did not yet know where, and she watched him go from the kitchen window. She did not let her hand fidget on the rim of the basin where she had washed the dishes. But she stood at the basin 1 beat longer than the dishes warranted, with her hands stilled in the warm water, and her boy at the table watched her stand there, and the boy did not say anything either, because he had been 7 the 1st August his father had gone, and he had learned to read his mother by the 2nd August. He came back at 4. The bay mare stood at the rail. He sat at the kitchen chair across from her boy, and she took the cloth off his arm, and she laid a fresh cloth and fresh lard along the inside of his forearm, and she tied it, and she said, 6 in the morning. He said, 6 in the morning. He came back at 6. He rode in at the gate the way he had ridden past it every morning for a year. Only now he came up the lane to the kitchen door, and he tied the bay mare to the rail. She had coffee on the stove. He drank it, standing at the back kitchen door with his hat off, and the bandaged arm at his side, and at 6:30 he set the empty cup on the block, and he picked up the long pry bar that he had set against the porch rail the evening before, and he went out to the south wall of the barn, and he began. She watched him from the kitchen window for 1 beat. Then she went out to the chicken coop, and she went on with her work. That was the first week of the barn. Mrs. Lavinia Sutter, at the dry goods at the crossroads, heard about the barn from Mrs. Pell at the post office on the Thursday of the first week, and Mrs. Lavinia Sutter had been the moral health of the south end of the section line for the 11 years since her own children had married off, and she had been waiting for Hetty Renner to come into the dry goods alone since the 1st August after Hetty Renner's husband had died. Hetty came into the dry goods on the Friday at noon for 2 yards of muslin and a tin of lamp oil. Mrs. Lavinia Sutter had her gloves on at the counter. Mrs. Renner, Mrs. Sutter, I have been hearing, I'm sure you have, I have heard that Mr. Brune out of the south section has been at your kitchen at 6 in the morning for the better part of the week. He has. Mrs. Sutter set both gloved hands flat on the counter. I would not have heard the matter at all, Mrs. Renner, if I had not been told. I would not have heard the matters of any of my neighbors at all, Mrs. Sutter, if you had not been telling them to me at this counter for 2 years. I will tell you about this one, and then I will not tell you about it again. Mr. Brune pulled my tobe out of a hayloft on Tuesday morning. He has a burn on his arm that runs from his wrist to his elbow that I am dressing twice a day. He is at my barn through the morning because the south wall is down, and I do not have the back of a man, and the rains come in October. He is at the kitchen at 6 because that is when I have the coffee on. He is at the south section road at 6 in the evening because that is where his fences are. He has not slept under my roof. He will not. That is the matter. Will you sell me the muslin and the lamp oil, Mrs. Sutter, or am I to walk down to the freight house for both? Mrs. Lavinia Sutter did not move for one long breath. She sold Hetty Renner the muslin and the lamp oil. She did not look at her when she rang it up. She put the tin of lamp oil in a paper sack and folded the top down the way a woman folds the top of a paper sack when she has been spoken to plain at her own counter and is determining what to do about it. At the door, she said one thing in a voice she did not raise. Mrs. Renner. Yes, Mrs. Sutter. The man rode past your gate every morning for a year. He did. That is a long time to ride past a gate without going in. I know it, Mrs. Sutter. Hetty Renner walked out to the wagon. She did not let her hands shake on the reins. The second week of the barn was the south wall studs going back up. He came at 6 on the Monday morning, and he had a small bundle of fresh pine studs tied behind the bay mare's saddle that he had cut himself from the small pine brake at the back of the south section the evening before. He set them down at the south wall of the barn, and he did not say anything about them, and she did not ask. She made the coffee. He worked in the morning and rode south at noon. He took the noon dinner at her kitchen table for the second week running, because she had told him on the Friday that the burn was not yet right, and he had nodded once, and that had been the end of it. Her boy moved his chair on the Tuesday of the second week from the far side of the table to the chair beside the cowboy's chair, and the cowboy did not announce it, and the boy did not announce it, and Hetty Renner served the noon dinner from the head of the table, and did not announce it either. The chair slid a quiet 8 inches sideways on a Tuesday at 12:30, and stayed there. By the Thursday of the second week, the boy had begun to follow the cowboy out to the south wall after the noon dinner. The cowboy did not send him back. He set the boy a job, the holding of a stud upright at the plate while the cowboy drove the long iron nails. The boy held the stud the way he had been told to hold it. He did not let go even when the cowboy raised the hammer. The cowboy looked at the boy across the stud once, and the corner of the cowboy's mouth moved the smallest fraction, and he went back to the nail. On the Friday of the second week, he had brought a small wooden pencil sharpener for the boy. He set it on the corner of the table beside the boy's plate, and he did not say anything about it. The boy looked at the sharpener and then up at him. "What is it for?" "For your pencil. I do not have a pencil that needs sharpening." "You will." He went back to his beans. The boy watched him for one beat, and then he picked up the sharpener, and he held it in his hand for the rest of the meal under the table, the way a boy holds a small important thing. That night, at 4 o'clock, she changed the cloth on his arm at the kitchen table. The burn was no longer wet. It was going to scar. She tied a clean cotton cloth over it for the last time, and she said, "You do not have to come at 6 tomorrow morning for the arm." He said, "I will come for the south wall." She said, "The south wall is studs." He said, "The studs need the bracing." She said, "That suits." He went out. The third week of the barn was the first lift of the loft joists. He brought up the heavy oak timbers her husband had cut 6 years ago, and they had stood stacked at the side of the barn for 6 years, and the cowboy lifted them one at a time with the rope and the pulley, and he set them home in the new pine plates, and her boy held the rope at the bottom, and she set the long iron bolts. They worked the way 3 people work who have begun to know how the work moves between them. On the Wednesday afternoon of the third week, the cowboy did a small thing she had not asked him to do. The step at the back porch had been worn through at the corner for 2 years, and she had laid an old board across it the previous spring to keep her boy from going through it. The cowboy walked past it on his way to the bay mare, and he stopped at it, and he looked at it for one beat. He came back at 6 in the morning the next day with a clean-cut pine plank under his arm. He set the plank against the porch rail. He took up the long pry bar, and he lifted the old broken step out, and he set the new plank in, and he nailed it home, and he set the long pry bar back against the porch rail, and he went out to the south wall. He did not say anything about it. At noon dinner that day, the boy stopped at the new step on his way in, and he tested it twice with his boot. He came inside. He said, "Mr. Brune, the step is fixed." The cowboy said, "That is what a step does when it is not broken." The boy looked at him for one beat. Then the boy looked down at his plate, and the corner of the boy's mouth moved the smallest fraction. At noon dinner on the Wednesday of the third week, the boy looked up from his plate, and he said, "Mr. Brune." And the cowboy said, "Tobe." And the boy said, "Will you stay for supper sometime?" The cowboy did not answer at once. Hetty Renner did not look up from her plate. She had heard the question. She set her fork down small and steady, and she waited. The cowboy said, "That is for your mother to say, son." The boy looked at his mother. Hetty Renner set the fork on the edge of the plate. She put both hands flat on the table beside her plate. She did not let them fidget. She said, "Mr. Brune." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "The south wall comes up next week. The loft floor comes up the week after. After the loft floor is the rains in October. You will be at this kitchen at 6 in the morning until the rains come, because that is the matter we are inside of. You will be at this kitchen at noon dinner, because you cannot ride south on a noon dinner you have not eaten. You may come to supper at 6 in the evening on a Sunday if it suits you, because Sunday is not a noon dinner day at this house, and a Sunday supper is a thing a neighbor may come to without anyone in the section taking the matter further than it is. That is what I'm asking." He thought about it for the space of 2 breaths. He said, "That suits." The first Sunday supper, he came at 5:45 in the evening with his hat in his hand and his good shirt on, the shirt clean and pressed soft, the way a man who lives alone presses a shirt for a Sunday. He sat at the chair across from her boy. She had made the supper she would have made anyway, beans and cornbread and a small piece of pork and the last of the green beans from the row at the side of the house, and she set the supper on the table, and she sat at the head of it, and they ate the slow supper a kitchen has on a Sunday evening when a thing is not yet a thing, and the kitchen is letting it be what it is. When the supper was done, he stood up to go, and the boy said, "Will you come next Sunday?" He looked at Hetty. She said, "That suits." The second Sunday supper, he came at 5:45 in the evening with a small jar of honey in his hand, and he set it on the kitchen block without saying anything about it. After supper, the boy showed him a small pencil drawing of a horse he had made on a piece of brown butcher paper with the pencil the cowboy had brought him for the sharpener. The cowboy looked at the drawing for a long beat, and he said, "That is a horse, son," and the boy said, "That is the bay." And the cowboy said, "I see her," and he set the drawing back down on the table. The cowboy's coffee cup had been at the far end of the kitchen table on the first Tuesday morning. It had been at the middle of the table the second week. It had been at the place beside her cup at the head of the table by the third Sunday supper. Neither of them had announced any of it. The man came up the lane on the fourth Sunday at 5:45 in the evening on a dust-orange horse with a worn, dark coat that had been brushed for the visit, and a hat held off his head in his hand. His name was Owen Trask. He had been the foreman at the section line ranch east of Hetty Renner's section the year her husband had died, and he had asked her to marry him the spring after the funeral, and she had said no, plain, and he had ridden out, and he had not been back up the lane in 2 years, and the section had heard the matter of Mr. Brune by the second Tuesday of the third week, and Mr. Owen Trask had heard it by Friday, and had ridden 40 miles in the cool of a September Sunday afternoon to put the matter in front of Hetty Renner at her own porch step at her own supper hour. The cowboy was at the chair beside her boy's chair when the dog at the porch began to bark. The cowboy did not stand up. He set his fork down. Hetty Renner went to the door. "Mr. Trask, Mrs. Renner, it is Sunday supper. I know it. You will not come past the gate. I have come up to the porch step, ma'am. I see it. I have come up to ask whether the matter I've heard in the section is the matter that is being walked. The matter you have heard is the matter I have lived for 3 weeks, and I will not stand on this porch step and walk the matter for you on a Sunday at 5:45. Mr. Brune is at the table because the loft floor goes up Tuesday, and a man does not lay a loft floor on a noon dinner he has not eaten. You may turn the horse, Mr. Trask. You may ride south. The matter of you was settled at this porch step 2 years ago, and I'm not going to settle it a second time on a Sunday at supper." Owen Trask did not move for one breath. He looked past her into the kitchen. He saw the cowboy at the table beside her boy. He said, "You have a man at your table on a Sunday at supper, Mrs. Renner." The cowboy set his napkin on the table. He stood up. He came to the door behind her, and he stopped one pace back from her shoulder, and he did not put his hand on her shoulder, and he did not step in front of her. He did not need to. He said, "Mr. Trask." Owen Trask looked at him. The cowboy said, "Mrs. Renner has answered you twice. I have known Mrs. Renner 3 weeks. I have known the South Road at the section line for 9 years. The South Road runs to the deputy at the crossroads. The deputy at the crossroads is my younger brother, and he will believe me when I tell him what I have heard at this porch step on a Sunday at 5:45 in the evening. You will be at the crossroads by the time the deputy is finished with his Sunday supper, and you will be on the South Road back to Belle Plains by the time the sun is at 8, and you will not come back up this lane. That is the matter. I am paying it." Owen Trask's mouth thinned once. He looked at Hetty Renner. He looked at the cowboy. He put his hat on. He stepped down off the porch step. He got back on his horse. He turned the horse. He rode out down the lane at a walk in the cool September evening, in plain sight of the road, with the dust at the gate settling slow behind him. The cowboy did not move from the doorway until the dust had settled. Then he stepped back, and he held the kitchen door open with his good hand, and he said, "Ma'am, your supper is getting cold." Hetty Renner came in past him. She did not let her hands fidget on the back of her chair when she pulled it out. She sat down. She picked up her fork. The boy looked from one of them to the other. He said, "Mr. Brune, Tobe." The boy did not finish the thing he had been going to say. He picked up his fork. He ate his potatoes. Hetty Renner ate the rest of her supper across the table from the cowboy in the slow quiet of a kitchen where a thing has just been settled in the doorway. When the boy had finished and gone out to feed the dog at the porch, the cowboy and Hetty Renner sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the platter empty and the kitchen warm from the stove, and he set his coffee cup down at the place beside her cup at the head of the table, and neither of them had announced any of it. She said, "Mr. Brune." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "You rode past my gate every morning for a year." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why did you not stop?" He said, "You had buried a man 2 Augusts before I came up that road the first time. I did not know whether you were a woman who had a husband still in her chest or a woman who did not. A man does not ride into a woman's yard on the strength of a year of riding past it to find out which one she is. He waits to be asked, or he waits to be needed. I had not been asked. Tuesday morning I was needed." She did not speak for the space of 3 breaths. She kept her eyes on his. She said, "You have a section of your own at the South Road?" He said, "I do." "A small one?" "A small one. 60 head, a pine brake, a creek that runs through July most years. You live alone on it?" "I do." "How long?" 9 years. She did not ask the next question, because the next question was not a question that could be asked out loud yet. She set her cup down on the saucer. She looked at the cup for 1 beat. She looked back at him. She said, "You have been at this kitchen at 6 in the morning for 3 weeks. You have been at the noon dinner for 3 weeks. You have come to Sunday supper 3 Sundays running. You have settled a matter at my porch step that I had thought I had settled by myself 2 years ago. You have a burn on your arm from my barn that is going to be on your arm for the rest of your life. I am asking a thing I have not been asking, Mr. Brune. I am asking whether the chair beside my boy's chair is going to keep on being your chair after the rains come." He set both hands flat on the table. He said, "It will." She said, "That is what I'm asking." He said, "I am answering." The loft floor went up the second week of October the way they had said it would, and the rains came the third week of October the way the rains always came at the south end of the section, and the south wall held, and the loft floor held, and the new step at the back porch held under 3 weeks of wet boots. The cowboy came at 6 in the morning through the rains, and he drank his coffee at the back kitchen door with the rain still on his shoulders, and he went out to the barn and he worked. And at noon dinner he came in and he hung his hat on the wall peg by the back kitchen door, on the peg beside her boy's small hat that had been hanging there alone for 2 years. And the peg beside the cowboy's hat was the empty peg that had not held anything since the August her husband had gone. By the end of October, the boy had begun to call him Cale. She had not asked him to. The cowboy had not asked him to. It had come at supper one Sunday in the middle of a thing the boy was saying about the bay mare, and the boy had stopped at the sound of it in his own mouth, and he had looked at his mother once across the table to see what his mother would do, and his mother had not done anything, and the cowboy had not done anything, and the boy had gone on with what he had been saying about the bay mare, and the name had stayed. The first frost did not come until the second week of November that year. The cowboy was at the kitchen at 6 on the morning of the frost, and he drank his coffee at the back kitchen door, and he looked at her across the kitchen, and he said, "Ma'am." She said, "Mr. Brune." He said, "The chapel at the crossroads has a Sunday service at 11. She said, "I know it." He said, "I have not been at the chapel since I came up the South Road 9 years ago. I am going to be at the chapel this coming Sunday at 11. I would have you and the boy come with me to the chapel, and I would have the deacon read the deed of marriage at the end of the service, if that suits you." She set her cup down on the saucer. She kept her eyes on his. She said, "That suits me." He nodded once. He set the empty cup on the block. He picked up his hat from the peg beside her boy's hat. He went out to the barn. They were married at the small white chapel at the crossroads on a clear, cool Sunday in the second week of November after the rains had come and the loft floor was tight and the south wall was painted, with Mrs. Pell from the post office standing up with her and the deputy at the crossroads who was Cale Brune's younger brother performing the witness of the deed, and Mrs. Lavinia Sutter sat in the third pew with her gloves folded on her lap, and at the end of the service she stood at the steps of the chapel and said one thing to Hetty in a voice she did not raise. "Mrs. Brune, Mrs. Sutter, the man rode past your gate every morning for a year. He did. I will see you Wednesday next at the counter. You will." Hetty Brune walked back down the lane to the small farmhouse at the south end of her section that warm, cool November Sunday, with Cale Brune beside her and her boy ahead of them with the dog. And the kitchen had coffee on the stove the way the kitchen had had coffee on the stove for 3 months running. And the chair beside her, boy's chair, was the cowboy's chair. And the bay mare was at the rail at the side of the house instead of at the road. And the burn on the cowboy's left forearm was a long, pale line from his wrist to his elbow that the kitchen lamp lit warm at the edges every evening at supper. That night, at supper, the boy reached across the table for the salt, and the cowboy slid the salt to him without looking up from his plate, the way a man slides the salt to a son he has been at the table with for a long time. And the boy took the salt and salted his potatoes and set the salt back at the center of the table between the 3 of them, and none of the 3 of them said anything about it, and the kitchen lamp burned warm on the table, and the wind came up at the south wall of the barn, and the wall held. This was the story of Hetty Renner and Cale Brune. the woman whose barn was burning, and the cowboy who had ridden past her gate every morning for a year and stopped on the morning he was needed. Tell me in the comments if you enjoyed this one. We are always glad you came to listen.